Well, it's time for us to focus on EcoWatch, and tonight we will be taking a look at the National Land Use Policy that was launched by the government, a 72-page document that is seeking to look at how exactly can we be able to manage our resources, issues of sustainability, and how can we also be able to address some of the land conflict issues that we continue to have, and issues of planning our cities and our counties, even now as we moved into the devolved structure of government. And just to give us their perspective of what really is contained in this policy and what are some of the issues and how can we address them, joining me in studio now we have with us Augustine Masinde, who is the Director of Physical Planning in the Ministry of Lands, as well as Dr. Lawrence Esho, who is the Chairperson of the Kenya Institute of Planners. They will be giving us insights on this particular policy and going forward, how can we address some of our land use, some of the land, how we use our land. Gentlemen, thank you for coming to our studios.
Thank you for having us.
All right, even before we talk about, the policy that you have launched today, and I want to start with you, Augustine. Where are we in terms of progress of managing our land?
Thank you. Over the past 5 years, the Ministry of Lands and Fiscal Planning has been implementing a reform program to address issues to do with land administration and management by first of all putting in place policy and legislative mechanisms to address issues of management, institutional structures, as well as mechanisms for handling of the various issues that touch on land.
So it's still in terms of legislation. Implementation, where are we?
Now, in terms of implementation, we have started with setting up of institutional structures. And one of the outputs of that process is the operationalization of the National Land Commission. We have codified the many legislative instruments that we had previously into 4 statutes for purpose of land administration. We now have Community Land Act, a new piece of legislation. We have the Land Act, the Land Registration Act, as well as the Land Act, all of them that are now under implementation.
Okay.
The regulatory framework is already in place. And what we now have at the moment is a formulation of 2 critical instruments. One, the National Spatial Plan, which was launched in March last year. And today, we had a historical moment in which we launched the National Land Use Policy, that is Sessional Paper number 1 of 2017.
Okay, all right. He has talked about, several pieces of legislation that have been put in place. In terms of change on the ground, are we managing our land? When did, when did the rain start beating us? And are we really managing our land, despite having all these beautiful pieces of legislation?
Thank you very much. I think that's the challenge the country is facing, and that is the challenge which the policy seeks to address, as well as the plans. Policies usually form the basis for legislation, and then the legislation form the basis for formulation of frameworks which can assist us, regulatory frameworks, to go to address certain challenges that we have in relation to land. We have had these regulatory frameworks over the years. The implementation has not been that strong. It has been weak, and that probably is to blame for some of the challenges that we're experiencing now. But also we have a very dynamic and strong market which seems to run much faster than the ability of government to control development. However, I think that is going to change because you remember we had an overly centralized governance system. Now with devolution, this gives an opportunity for a whole 47 counties being involved in the process of regulating land use, in the manner in which we use land. So
at what point do you think we really lost it when it came to planning of how we use our land?
I think we lost it when the land was unbundled into the market sometime in the late 80s and early 90s. Remember previously, if you wanted to develop some land, you applied to government with a proper plan of how you intend to use the land. The government then will, plus the money, you show that you have the money. The government will allocate you the money to do so, the land, and then we'll give you a time frame within which you will
develop it,
and,
yes.
and proper conditions which you will have to follow to develop the land. Kenyans were also not so much hungry for urban land, for instance. We focus so much on rural land and for production purposes. But then there is almost a complex, a land complex. Everyone wants a piece of Kenya. And I think that's where the challenge came in the sense that in the process, then we've overly subdivided our land.
Yes.
And then, so creating a huge dynamic in which it becomes very difficult, a huge development dynamic which is very difficult to master. However, I think with the current programs in government, I think we should be able to get ourselves back on track to controlling that. Yeah.
Augustine, how will we be able to do that? Because like you said, today everyone wants to own, a piece of land, either an eighth or a quarter, for speculation reasons. Then we have those who have large tracts of land that remain unused. So how does the policy, recommend how we can be able to address this particular challenge? Because the thirst for land is real.
Yeah, one of the things that we must address, which is fairly historically perspective, is dealing with the problem of speculative behavior in the land market, where, as my colleague says, people want to buy land and own it for its own sake. And in the process, we have ended up with the problem of subdividing land into an economic and sustainable units.
Yes.
And one of the things that we have to address through the policy framework is having very clear standards and guidelines that will prohibit subdivision of land beyond unsustainable units. And to be able to do that, of course, we have the policy guidelines, we're going to have the standards, but we also have to build the capacity of the current government institutional structures to give them the necessary capacity to be able to deal with these things, do the enforcement, and ensure that there is a planned framework and way of doing things in all the areas of jurisdiction.
All right. The other aspect is informal settlements, because those ones are rising a lot in different cities. How do we address that particular problem? Because that is a lot of land that is just lying there and is not really been put into a sustainable kind of way.
Informality is a consequence of our planning legacy. Colonially, the colonial planning legacy was based on segregation, which was racial segregation at the time. And then after independence, we adopted a social segregation. And the planning system has tended to leave out the lower income segments of the population without thinking about them in plans. So even though we plan for them, the plans are not adequate enough to respond positively and effectively to the needs of those lower income segments of the population. You also remember that in the post-independent era, immediately after independence, people moved into town at a rate that was much faster than the ability of government to provide for those people. So they were transitioning from rural-based, agriculture-based vocations, and then they came to the city, and in most cases, there was not enough employment. Now, when they came to the city, most of what they did is just squat on land that was available, that was public land. However, in the last few years, what we've seen government doing is we've had several programs. We've had the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program. We've had Kenya Informal Settlements Project, whose the aim has been to plan these informal settlements, issue people with titles, provide infrastructure in those informal settlements. But going forward, I think there has also been a lot of change in the mindset of a lot of planners in this country, that we need to come up with solutions that actually cater for those lower segments of lower income segments of the population, and not just for the rich. So I think with the time we will be able to solve some of these problems.
And
okay, he's talked about, the rural-urban migration. Now we see everybody saying tunarudi mashinani. We are going back to the county. So are we prepared in terms of if everybody moves back, to the counties, what are we likely to see in terms of planning at that level?
Yeah, one of the measures that government is taking is expanding the economy of the country beyond Nairobi and the existing big cities. The intention is to identify, plan, and develop more growth centers so that you have alternative areas of employment, alternative areas where people can find opportunities for training and education. And what we have to do, as already elaborated under the Big Four agenda, is to focus on housing development that address the needs of all categories of the market, all segments of the market. We are emphasizing on developing housing in terms of housing that are affordable and also social housing, so that we are able to address the needs of all Kenyans. People who find themselves within the informal settlements should be able to find alternative and affordable housing to cater for the needs of their families, and also to be able to provide the necessary infrastructure services which Kenyans require throughout the country.
Of course, there was a blueprint, even when we talk about Nairobi City being the way it is today. There was a plan, but in terms of implementation, why are we not following these plans? Because there have been claims of, bribery such that you are allowed to build on, waterways. We are seeing people building in places where they're not supposed to, yet we condone it. How do we tackle this problem?
This is a real challenge which we have had as a country, and it stems from a number of factors. One is weak institutional structures. Remember, we had local authorities before the current dispensation, and most of these local authorities do not have the adequate technical capacity and also having the necessary professional outlay to be able to deal with these issues. We reached a point where there was total breakdown in terms of institutional responsibility. Integrity became an issue to the extent that the ability and willingness to enforce the existing standards and regulations broke down completely. And what we are focusing now is building up the structures within the counties, give them the technical capacity, let them have adequate human resource base, men and women who are well trained and qualified, and of course also dealing with the issues of integrity, so that people who have taken advantage of such weaknesses to carry out activities that are injurious to the environment will not find room to do such things.
To do such things. All right. In terms of this particular policy, what are the key highlights that focus on how exactly we can be able to plan our land? Because we're almost running out of time.
Okay. I think the primary objective of the policy is to ensure that land is sustainably used in this country and optimally used, and also equitably distributed amongst all Kenyans. And the policy advocates a system whereby planning becomes the primary consideration. All land has to be planned prior to being occupied. And I think that has been the focus of the last 10 years or so, that counties now are starting to engage in planning activities, planning their territories, so that then they are able to control the development, as it were. So the policy emphasizes the need for land use planning, because this is a land use, national land use policy. And the best way to implement it is through land use plans and land use legislation. We also have the physical planning bill, which is in Parliament, which is also being enacted. But as the director put it, the most important thing is for counties to build the capacity of counties themselves to be able to implement this policy and step it down into implementable tools at their level.
So what will it take to implement this particular policy?
What we now require to do moving forward, first is to rationalize our existing sectoral policies and legislations. Because one of the challenges we face is that we have many different sectors, and each sector has its own piece of legislation, its own piece of policy, some of which conflict and contradict each other. So the foremost assignment we have is to start rationalizing those policies and legislations.
So it's sort of like to audit what you have and collapse it into one. Okay.
And come up with the standards and guidelines that are uniform and address the needs of the country in terms of land management and planning. The other thing that we have to do is to have a well-coordinated institutional structure across all the sectors. The various ministries, departments, and agencies have to work in harmony to address these challenges. to the extent that we will not want to have a situation where, say, NEMA has approved a development which the city county of Nairobi disapproves of. We need to have that coordination so that we are all speaking from the same script.
Sometimes we are accused of, over legislating, just like you pointed out, there are so many policies that sort of, tend to duplicate one another. So in terms of, implementation, why should we believe that it's going to be different? This policy, why should we believe that it's going not to gather dust like all the others that, have gathered dust before this, that now you're saying you need to re-audit what we have? What is different about this one? Are you putting your money where your mouth is in terms of implementation? Yeah,
if you listen to the statement by His Excellency the Deputy President, it's quite clear that there is commitment by government to implement this policy. One, bring together all the sectoral agencies to hammer out a roadmap to start implementation. Two, engage with the Parliament to review the existing legislations and regulations. Three, to put in adequate budgetary allocation to provide the necessary resource base to be able to deal with the challenge that we have. So this time around, there is a seriousness of purpose, and government is putting its money where it is. After all, implementation of this policy is one of the foundations for implementation of the Kenya Vision 2030 and attainment of the objectives of the Big Four agenda. Definitely, government is committed, and this is what is going to be done. All right. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'll give you an opportunity just to give your closing comments.
Yes. I think in terms of closing, I would just like to encourage Kenyans. Kenyans are very fond of saying, poor planning, whenever there is a problem in this country. But we must accept liability also for causing some of these problems. And as an institute, our mission is to make Kenya a planning society. So we want to encourage that consciousness that we must plan if we have to have the country that we want. And part of what we've been doing is, part of what the director mentioned is that we didn't have human resources capacity in that area, but plenty of universities now are training professionals in this area, and therefore counties should absorb these professionals so that they are now able, they no longer have an excuse. They can't say that there is no human resource. We've trained a lot of planners, so let them just employ those planners, and the experts will help them do the work well.
All right. Unfortunately, our time is up, but thank you both for coming to our studios and, of course, shedding light on some of these policies and what you're doing to try and ensure we utilize our land well. After all, the Constitution puts an entire chapter on land and environment, so it is important for us to implement this. All right. This is where we have to put a cap on Eco Watch tonight. Of course, our guest in studio, we had with us Augustine Masinde, who is the Director of Physical Planning at the Ministry of Lands, as well as Dr. Lawrence Esho, who is the chairperson of the Kenya Institute of Planners. Caroline Achieng'a is up next with the day's business.